You know, it's a wild story when you think about it. A single company showing up just to trade some spices and cloth and somehow ending up as the ruler of an entire subcontinent? That's pretty much the story of the East India Company in India. So today, we're going to dig into how their constant need for cash didn't just build an empire, it completely tore apart and rebuilt life in the Indian countryside. And it all really boils down to this one question, right? How does a bunch of foreign merchants become the ultimate landlord for an entire nation? Well, the answer is way simpler and maybe a little more ruthless than you'd think. It's all about one thing: money. So our story really gets going the moment the East India Company gets political control over Bengal. All of a sudden, they're not just traders anymore. They're rulers. And they've got this massive new problem. They've got an administration to run, an army to pay for, and of course, shareholders back in London who want to see some serious profits. And the costs were just huge. I mean, running a government, maintaining a private army, that stuff isn't cheap. And at the same time, the company directors are breathing down their necks, demanding a return on their investment. The pressure to find a steady, massive river of cash was absolutely immense. So they pretty quickly zeroed in on the single most valuable asset in the entire subcontinent: the land itself. Land revenue, basically a tax on farming, was going to be the financial engine for the whole British operation. The only challenge was, what's the most efficient way to suck all that money out? And this hunt for efficiency led them to their first big, and I mean big, experiment. It was a system that would end up having some really profound and honestly devastating consequences for millions of people. They called it the permanent settlement. Okay, so here's the deal they cooked up in 1793. The idea seemed simple, almost clever. The British basically pointed to local landlords, the zamindars, and said, "Congrats, you're now the official owners of all this land." Their job, squeeze rent from the farmers and deliver a fixed or permanent amount to the company. But here's the catch, and it was a brutal one. If they failed to pay up, for any reason, they lost everything. Now, on paper, this must have looked great to the British. It seemed efficient, hands-off, but in the real world, it was a complete nightmare for the people actually working the land. The zamindars weren't thinking about improving farming. They were just focused on grabbing as much cash as they could to hit their target and pocket the difference. And this kicked off a horrible, devastating cycle. A farmer gets hit with these crazy high taxes from the zamindar. To pay, he has to take out a loan. But then what happens if there's a drought or a flood? The harvest is ruined, and there's no way to pay back the loan. And the result? He loses his land, the same land his family had farmed for generations. He becomes a landless worker on his own fields. But the permanent settlement, that wasn't their only idea. As the company grabbed more and more territory, they just kept experimenting with new ways to extract wealth. They tried a few different models, but for the farmers on the ground, the story was tragically the same every single time. Take a look. You had the Mahalwari system, where the whole village was on the hook for the tax. Then there was the Ryotwari system, where the company went right to the individual farmer. But just look at that last column. See a pattern here? Whether it was a landlord, a village headman, or a British official, the result was always the same: crushing taxes and the constant fear of losing everything. So that's the real takeaway here. At the end of the day, it just didn't matter what they called the system. For the person actually out there tilling the soil, they were getting squeezed from all sides. The focus was always on extraction, never on investment or, making things better for the people. But just taking a slice of the harvest wasn't enough. Oh no. The Industrial Revolution was roaring back in Britain, and it was hungry for raw materials. So the company decided it wasn't just going to tax the farmers, it was going to tell them what to grow. By force, if it had to. And the star crop was a plant called indigo. The stuff produced this amazing, brilliant blue dye that was absolutely essential for the booming textile mills back in Britain. So European planters, with the full backing of the company, set up shop in India to produce it on a massive scale. For the farmers, this was a total disaster. They were often forced to plant indigo on their best land, instead of the rice they needed to feed their families. Worse, the indigo plant just wrecked the soil, sucking out all the nutrients. And to top it all off, the planters paid them almost nothing and trapped them in this impossible cycle of loans they could never, ever escape. So for decades, this pressure just builds and builds. You've got the high taxes, the crushing debt, and now you're being forced to grow this crop that's ruining your land. Eventually, something's got to give. And in 1859, it did. The countryside just exploded in what became known as the Blue Rebellion. I mean, you can just see this long fuse being lit, can't you? It starts all the way back in 1793 with systems like the permanent settlement, and conditions just get worse and worse. By 1859, the breaking point is finally reached, and a massive revolt against these indigo planters just erupts all across Bengal. And we're not talking about some small protest. This was huge. Thousands and thousands of farmers in Bengal just stopped. They refused to plant any more indigo. They boycotted the planters, they attacked their factories, and they stood together against the system that had been breaking their backs for so long. The rebellion was so big, so widespread, that it actually forced the British administration to step in and investigate. And while it did put an end to the absolute worst of the forced indigo system in Bengal, the wider damage from Britain's rural policies, that was permanent. The legacy they left behind was just a landscape of poverty. The company's policies trapped generations of farmers in debt. Millions lost their land, and the entire agricultural economy was basically broken, re-engineered for just one purpose: extraction. And that really brings us to the core truth of this whole thing. None of these systems, none of these policies were ever designed with the Indian farmer's well-being in mind. Not once. They were just tools, instruments of a colonial machine that was built to pull wealth out of the ground and ship